Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, show on India's national broadcaster Doordarshan about Indian foreign policy, India's international relations and India's involvement in solving major global problems. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up the phenomenon of India's international rescue missions and evacuations of its citizens who are stranded in dire conditions in crisis zones around the world. And to discuss this, I have a special guest with me in the studio. Let me introduce you to him, Captain Alok Bansal.
Thank you.
Captain Bansal is director at the nationalistic think tank India Foundation and a former naval officer who has commanded warships and served in the Indian Navy for more than 3 decades. Captain, it's an honor to have you in the studio. Welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you.
Captain Bansal, rescue missions, India has earned a name for itself as a global leader in this area and in this field, and over the years we have honed the skills. Our armed forces have done this for decades now with great success, and we have a huge diaspora around the world, 32 million and counting, NRIs as well as people of Indian origin, and inevitably, wherever there's a crisis there are Indians there, and so we have seen this now recently with the crisis in Sudan, in Africa, with Operation Kaveri, and we have been trying to extricate all our citizens as well as help citizens of other countries, and this has a tradition. So I'd like you to start by telling the audience why we are so good at this, and what is it that our armed forces bring to the table that is so unique. What is our USP when we do these complex emergency evacuations?
See, firstly, we need to understand that these evacuations require a very, very good collaboration between diplomacy and defense. I think there are only 2 dimensions to these rescue missions, that is defense and diplomacy. And I think our defense forces have actually become experts in dealing in adversities actually. And today we have acquired a name for ourselves. If you remember, when we evacuated citizens from Yemen, US State Department issued an advisory to all American citizens saying that we have no representation in Yemen. American citizens should contact Indian mission, and they have assured that they will pull out everyone who contacts them. That was an assurance. Earlier also, wherever we have pulled out people, we have actually managed to pull out citizens of other friendly foreign countries. And in this particular mission, which is Sudan, is of course a very, very complex issue, because here you have 2 militias fighting. And while both militias have given assurances that we will adhere to ceasefire and they will maintain ceasefire for 3 days, then now again 7 days. But these ceasefires we have seen have been violated more as a rule than as an exception, because you have people who are not really well disciplined, well trained, and they are actually. So it is the capabilities of the Indian armed forces to deal in such operations. Like in Sudan, you saw Indian Air Force planes landing in pitch dark airfields using night vision devices. I think that shows the skill levels of Indian armed forces, and also the collaboration between the 3 services. You have Navy ships at Port Sudan, you have aircraft landing in Khartoum and other places. So that shows how Indian armed forces are able to move around and extricate people in such complex and troubled spots of the world.
And Alokji, presumably our forces, they train for these emergencies, right? I mean, the humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, the HADR missions, of course, we know they train. We have actually done an episode on that in Indian Diplomacy. But for these kind of mass evacuations in emergencies where there is fighting going on all around and where there is high risk to lives of our citizens, I mean, the record shows, I mean, touch wood, we have lost very few of our citizens in these, crises, because we've been able to go in fast and get them out, securely. And in the armed forces, I'm sure all 3 wings of the armed forces, we train regularly and prepare for these contingencies, isn't it?
See, firstly, we need to understand that innovation is the characteristics of Indian psyche. So innovation is actually a very, very phenomenal phenomena in Indian armed forces as well. If you remember, when Operation Cactus took place, Indian Air Force planes landed in Malé International Airport with a tourist map. they had nothing else but a tourist map with which they landed at that airfield. So we have innovated, and one of the major operations which all three services take a lot of interest is in amphibious operations. And amphibious operations have amphibious assaults as well as amphibious withdrawals, like Dunkirk, and that where all three services have to collaborate and pull out citizens using amphibious operations. But in many of these cases which have been landlocked countries where you have to quickly evacuate your citizens, you have to send aircraft and pull them out. Very often people don't realize that it is not very easy to pull out people who are living in a foreign country. You need to understand that you can be an Indian who is living for 2 years in a, say, foreign country. Now you tell them just pack up in a suitcase and move.
Yeah.
It's not a very easy decision for that person to take, because he's living there, he's got a full-fledged household running, he doesn't know when he'll come back,
Yeah.
and if at all he'll come back.
High level of risk and uncertainty.
So what to leave behind, what to carry, one needs to understand that emotion, and that's why when people say just pull out people with one suitcases, it may not always be feasible. If there is time, people would want to take at least a certain level of belongings and move, and that's where heavy lift capabilities actually come into play. But when you have to quickly evacuate, you have to use air force and air resources, and of course army and the ground troops are essential to ensure a certain level of security at that particular point, because many of these areas are so complex that one really doesn't know who's fighting whom. It's happening in Sudan. You only hear gunshots are being fired. No clear picture is emerging as to who is occupying a particular area, who's firing and who's not firing.
Absolutely. So viewers, complex emergencies are such that it's very difficult terrain to operate, but Indian Armed Forces have really shown their mettle and capability time and again in these dire conditions, and have been able to whisk not only Indian citizens but also citizens of other countries who are facing risks to their lives. So on this the Operation Kaveri in Sudan, I have a very interesting video of the Indian Air Force mission that Captain Alok Bansal was already mentioning, in the pitch of the dark with very little logistical backup. The Indian Air Force did a daring rescue operation of more than 120 stranded Indian citizens in Sudan. Let's watch this video and continue the discussion. So, viewers, audacity and flawless execution, that's what the Indian Air Force is known for, and that's what they have done once again in Sudan. Captain Bansal, flawless execution, this is something we've already spoken about, and the professionalism and the skill of our armed forces. But clearly in all these complex emergencies, we also, like you said before, there is also the diplomatic element, and we try to engage with local actors to make sure there is safe passage for our citizens. And sometimes they give guarantees, but as you said, in these lawless zones, war zones, no guarantee is actually foolproof, and anything anytime can happen. So in that kind of circumstance, we just saw this daring, hair raising operation by the Indian Air Force. Now this kind of situation, what would the soldier go in with instructions? And I mean, as civilians in the audience, you are a former naval officer, what would the soldier be told, that what do we need to accomplish, what's the mission, and how do we do this?
See, this is where, if you saw the clip, they talked about the audacity. It is the audaciousness, because these sort of operations are not copybook operations. You have to go beyond the call of duty to perform them, and you have to do things which have not been done. Now, landing a big transport aircraft in pitch dark night on an unlit airfield with no navigational aids is not recommended anywhere.
Yeah.
The aircraft's manufacturers don't recommend it. So you have to do it. You have to test your skills. That audaciousness is required, and that requires a certain level of confidence as far as the pilots are concerned, that they will be able to land. They need a certain amount of confidence that yes, there may be firing from that airfield. You have no idea. And this is where I said the diplomacy and defense interface is very, very important. And that's why you saw in this particular operation, defense attaché was leading the operation.
Correct.
That is where very important is that this amalgamation of defense and diplomacy is very, very essential. And that's why I think it's very, very important that more and more Indian missions have defense wings, so that you have defense and diplomatic interface, because that defense attaché can assess the situation better.
He was posted in our embassy in Khartoum.
That's right.
Yeah.
And otherwise what happens is, for a diplomat it's very difficult to assess the tactical situation as is prevailing, whether an aircraft can, there may be a sniper sitting somewhere far off, he may not be visible to him, but once the aircraft lands, he can start firing. As you saw in this particular case, same airfield, the Turkish plane was fired at. So that's what I am trying to say, that is where you have to be. And as far as the soldiers are concerned, it has to be a soldier who is willing to take risks. And fortunately for us, Indian armed forces have those ethos, where soldiers go beyond the call of duty to perform. There you will find invariably there are numerous examples in Indian armed forces where people have gone well beyond the call of duty to take risks, go into and perform audacious operations to serve the cause of the nation.
So the selfless service motto, which is always, and then the other motto which has guided us always in these evacuations and complex emergencies, is the notion that leave no one behind. And our leadership, both civilian and military, have been very clear that we will try and do our utmost, and try and bring everyone back, because every single Indian overseas, her or his life is of value, and we would never abandon them. And that's a principal point, isn't it?
Undoubtedly. In fact, anybody who has reached the airfield has been evacuated, but not only Indian citizens. We have actually provided an helping hand to all our friendly countries. Yes. Anybody who has approached India that yes, our citizens are stranded and they may not have the facilities. Many of our smaller neighbors don't have the wherewithal to pull out their citizens from these troubled spots. And we have always provided them a helping hand. And as I said earlier, that not only to smaller neighbors, one of the biggest and most powerful country, the United States, depended on Indian evacuation when it came to Yemen. You remember that? And we have done evacuations in certain cases where there was an active conflict going on. You remember the Lebanese conflict. But also here we have to say that our diplomacy has also been extremely deft. We have managed to talk to the two sides, and there have been
even temporary
ceasefires. It happened in Yemen, it also happened in Lebanon for a time. So that is where I said both defense and diplomacy are integral for relief operations like this. And I think these relief operations give us a huge diplomatic payoff. Please
Yes.
remember, the citizens of other countries, when you evacuate, the amount of goodwill that you earn is
Absolutely.
far more than any other diplomatic gesture that you might make as far as those countries are concerned.
Yeah, the goodwill is forever, and they do remember that a friend in need, came to the rescue at the right time. And so India, in fact, Prime Minister Modi has said that the reason we are able to do this is also shows the growing influence of India, around the world. And this is just one manifestation of that. The fact that so many countries now rely on India to be able to pull out their citizens in crises. Even the most recent one in Sudan, we have evacuated citizens of neighboring countries as well, apart from Indians. So this just shows, I think, a broader conception of humanity, isn't it? I mean, in our approach to the world, of course, our citizens are always first and foremost our priority, but along with them, to the extent possible, we will serve the broader humanity, and that is a part of our civilizational ethos, isn't it?
Undoubtedly, Vasudev Kutumbakam, we have said in G20 motto also, you can see. So we are talking of humanity. We actually don't try and discriminate that if somebody is not our citizen, we will not provide a helping hand. But more significantly, what Prime Minister Modi has done is that he has told our SAARC neighbors, in fact, that some of them may not have facilities. So we will provide them. Like earlier he said SAARC satellite, we will provide them satellite. Now, if they have to evacuate their citizens and they don't have the facility, India is always willing to do that. And this is not only in this, in fact, there are so many fields where you can see India has gone and helped its neighbors, be it vaccine, be it satellite, and now you are seeing rescue missions. HADR, of course, has always been our specialty. In fact, in this particular, not only in our neighborhood, but in the wider Indian Ocean region, whenever there has been a crisis,
in the Middle
people
East,
have
in Africa,
people have dependent on it. And now Indian armed forces have shown that they have the capacity. We withdrew our citizens from Lebanon, we withdrew from
Libya.
Yemen, Libya, Ukraine, we pulled
Afghanistan,
out, Afghanistan. So all over the world now we have seen that we have the capacity, and this is very important, because please understand, Indian diaspora is a very, very valuable tool of Indian diplomacy. India's stature in the global committee of nations rises with the rise in the diaspora's standing. As Indian diaspora rises in US, the India-US relations have improved. Secondly, the diaspora is also a very powerful source of remittances that come to you, which is actually building up your foreign exchange reserves.
Yeah.
Now, for this diaspora to function overseas, they should be confident that there is a government which will pull them out in case they face any crisis. And that is a very, very important thing, that now Indian armed forces have shown that they have a global reach.
Absolutely.
They can pull out their citizens from any adversity anywhere in the globe. And that's a very important.
Absolutely. India has the back of its diaspora, and they should feel confident that wherever they are in trouble, India is there to look out for their well-being, says Captain Alok Bansal. Viewers, we've already spoken about the importance of diplomacy in these rescue missions, and on this I'd like you to hear India's External Affairs Minister Dr.Sreeram Chaulia talking about Operation Ganga, which was a very big mission that India did in 2022 when the Ukraine war began, and the kind of coordination it involved with so many countries, and also the whole of government approach of India to make sure that all our stranded citizens were safe and evacuated. Let's hear from Dr. Jaishankar and continue.
The strategy for evacuation was to take out Indian nationals from western neighboring countries of Ukraine, that were Poland, Slovak Republic, Hungary, Romania and Moldova. This was necessitated due to the closure of Ukrainian airspace on 24 February. To carry this out, we were required to strengthen our missions in these countries so that they could deploy teams at the border points, set up transit camps, operate effective control rooms, and facilitate the large number of air flights. Along with that, they also handled incoming humanitarian assistance. 47 additional MEA officials were dispatched to ensure these objectives, supplementing a pre-existing embassy strength of 58. Honorable members should appreciate that along with our embassy personnel, these officials have gone to extraordinary lengths in difficult circumstances to ensure that Operation Ganga was successful. Their constant intervention at border checkpoints helped to address severe challenges posed by over-congestion. Their liaison with local governments and community organizations was responsible for the boarding, lodging, and medical attention of evacuees. And of course, they handled the complexity of flight operations on the ground so that the return home was a smoother process. Under Operation Ganga, 90 flights have been operated, out of which 76 were civilian flights and 14 were Indian Air Force flights. The evacuation flights were from Romania, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia. While Indian Air Force rose to the occasion, most of the private airlines, and that includes Air India Express, Indigo, SpiceJet, Vistara, Go Air, and Air Asia, also participated enthusiastically.
So, viewers, you got a glimpse of the kind of complex mission that India undertook to rescue 22,000 Indians who were stuck in Ukraine at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. Captain Alok Bansal, we just heard the Indian External Affairs Minister talking about the liaison with many neighboring countries for passage, safe passage. And here was a classic example, Operation Ganga, where Air Force was involved and also by land, as well as local diplomatic missions of all the neighboring countries, Indian missions there, and no less than the Prime Minister himself, Dr. Jaishankar, has mentioned that he personally called President Vladimir Putin of Russia, President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine, and likewise in all the missions that we've been talking about in this episode, highest level attention has happened, and that's one way. Operation Rahat in Yemen, for example, Prime Minister Modi directly spoke to the Saudi King Salman and requested ceasefire so that our citizens could be evacuated through Yemen. And most recently with Operation Kaveri also in Sudan, Dr. Jaishankar said he had spoken to counterparts in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and that's how it's been made possible. So in a way, the crises are not isolated happening in one country, right? They are part of a region where there are other stakeholders who have influence in those countries, and we always try to leverage that influence to be able to make this happen, and that is the essence of this diplomacy, isn't it?
Undoubtedly. In fact, if you look at Ukrainian crisis, the amount of good relations we managed with Ukraine's neighbors from where citizens were evacuated, the good relations we had with Russia, and that's how we found that Indian citizens were allowed a free passage and were allowed to move out of the conflict zone without any hampering by any other country. In fact, it was a huge number which actually moved to these neighboring countries and where Indian missions and Indian diplomats were positioned. In fact, Indian government sent union ministers and other officials to all these countries so that Indian citizens could be evacuated from there. That requires a very high level of coordination, and of course this can only come when the person at the helm of affairs, that's our Honorable Prime Minister, took charge of this situation and in fact guided them, because we saw cabinet ministers, different cabinet ministers being positioned in different countries neighboring Ukraine from where the people were being pulled out. It again, as I said, it again requires a very high level of diplomacy. At the same time, you also need coordination with defense forces, because you saw the Air Force also carrying out evacuation, the naval ships also indulged in pulling out people, and similar thing happened in Yemen. Yemen, of course, it was easier because both the sides, the conflicting sides, had good relations with India. India was one of the fortunate countries which had very good relations with Iran as well as Saudi Arabia, whose proxies were in fact fighting in Yemen, and we could request them to stop conflict.
Using our channels. Captain Bansal, we are almost running out of time, but last point on Prime Minister's personal chemistry with world leaders. I mean, Dr. Jaishankar has said that when he is on the call saying our citizens are stuck in this area, please help, he says the counterpart, the president or the prime minister or the king on the other side knows him personally, and he says, "Oh, na nahi keh sakte," meaning they cannot say no to him because he has already built a rapport with them at a very personal level. So people sometimes ask, what is the value of personal chemistry at the summit level diplomacy? But in these crises, in these evacuations, we see that in a real way happening, isn't it?
Undoubtedly, today Prime Minister of India has a global persona. He has built up such personal chemistries that he can speak to virtually any global leader and get what we want. And that is what we have seen in this crisis situation. The other countries have gone out of their way to facilitate India. Here I must also say that in Dr. Jaishankar, we also have a very great diplomat who understands the coordination between diplomacy and defense. He is one of those few diplomats who understand how defense can also be used for as a powerful diplomatic tool. And this actually he is inherited, because his father was one of the architects who talked of defense and diplomacy, who felt that defense has a very important role to play both in geopolitics and international relations. And I think he has always understood. In fact, if you go back and see wherever he has been the envoy of India when he was a diplomat, he has always used defense also as a very, very powerful.
Absolutely. So viewers, the point is India is in good hands. India has got a visionary leadership that understands the link between defense and diplomacy, says Captain Alok Bansal. I want to thank him for valuable insights, for sharing with the audience. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
So viewers, the point is India is rising to the occasion. It's an inspirational story. It's a heroic story. What India's armed forces, India's diplomats and India's civilian leadership has done time after time, crisis after crisis, wherever there is violence and bloodshed around the world, and where our citizens as well as citizens of other countries are at risk, India has risen to the occasion. So this is something to feel proud about as an Indian, but also something to study and understand, because not every country which may want to do this has the capabilities to do this. So it's a combination of intent and capabilities, and that's what India is showing. Let's keep our eyes on India's rescue diplomacy, because the world is full of crises. There are more conflicts emerging in the contemporary global arena, and I'm sure that Indian forces and Indian leadership will again be called upon to the rescue sooner or later. So this is a great national asset to be celebrated, but also to be studied. Keep an eye on this, and I'll see you again next time. Until then, take care.